The night of the 7th of December 1982. In the small town of Ada, Oklahoma, as the streets slowly grew quiet after an ordinary day, 21-year-old Deborah Sue Carter was finishing her final hours of work at the Coachlight Club, where she worked as a waitress and bartender. To those who saw Deborah that night, everything initially appeared normal. She spoke with customers, carried out her familiar duties, and prepared to leave the establishment before returning to her own apartment. But a few hours later, a brief phone call became the final indication that Deborah was still alive. At approximately 2:30 a.m. on December 8, Deborah called her friend Gina Vieta. During the conversation, she said that something did not feel right, that she believed someone might be inside her apartment. On the other end of the line, Gina heard unusual sounds and sensed the fear in Deborah's voice. Deborah said she would check what was happening, and then the call ended. No one knew that it would be the last time Deborah would ever speak with someone she knew. Several hours later, her apartment in Ada became the center of a criminal investigation that would continue for decades. A young woman with a job, personal relationships, and a life of her own had become the victim of a crime that would shock the small community. The first images of the case remain preserved in old police files, crime scene photographs, and the memories of those who knew Deborah. But what made this case truly significant was not only the tragedy that occurred that night, but also everything that followed. The initial investigation led authorities to two men who were charged and convicted. One faced the death penalty, while the other received a sentence of life imprisonment. However, years later, advances in DNA technology revealed a completely different truth, showing that the original investigation had gone in the wrong direction. This was not only the story of a case that remained unresolved for decades. It was also a story about failures in the pursuit of justice, about years taken away from innocent people, and about the journey to restore the truth for Deborah Sue Carter. Deborah Sue Carter was a young woman living in Ada, Pontotoc County, Oklahoma, United States. At the time of the crime, she was only 21 years old, standing at the beginning of adulthood, a stage of life when many people begin making their own plans for the future and searching for stability. Ada was a small town in Oklahoma during the early 1980s, where relationships within the community were often close-knit. Residents knew one another through work, neighborhood connections, and familiar local places. It was a town where unusual changes in someone's life could quickly become noticeable. But it was also a community that had never faced an investigation as complex as the one that would follow. Deborah worked at the Coachlight Club, a local entertainment venue known in the area. Her job involved working as a waitress and bartender, a role that required regular contact with many different people each day. Through her work, Deborah built a wider circle of social connections and became known by many people throughout the community. Before her name appeared in an investigation file, Deborah was simply a young woman living her own life. She went to work, spent time with people she knew, maintained personal relationships, and tried to build a stable future in Ada. Nothing suggested that she would later become the center of a decades-long criminal case. The year 1982 was also a very different era in criminal investigations compared with today. DNA testing had not yet become a tool for identifying individuals or locating suspects. Investigators at the time relied mainly on witness statements, physical evidence collected from crime scenes, and traditional forensic methods. It was within this context that the case of Deborah Sue Carter began, starting an investigation that would continue to raise major questions about accuracy, justice, and the long search for the truth many years later. Before she became a name appearing in a decades-long investigation file, Deborah Sue Carter was simply a young woman living her familiar life in Ada, Oklahoma. Like many people, at the age of 21, she had daily responsibilities, personal relationships, and ordinary moments spent with the people around her. There was nothing in Deborah's life that suggested she would later become the center of a case that would deeply affect the local community. She worked at the Coachlight Club, where she held the role of waitress and bartender. It was an environment that brought her into contact with many different people, from co-workers to regular customers who visited the venue. For Deborah, her job at the club was simply part of her everyday routine. Each shift began and ended with a familiar rhythm. She saw familiar faces, spoke with the people around her, and carried out her responsibilities just like any other working day. The 7th of December 1982 began the same way. As the evening unfolded at the Coachlight Club, Deborah continued in the role everyone knew her for. Those who saw her that night saw a young woman working, interacting with others, and moving through an environment she had become accustomed to. None of them knew that those ordinary moments would later become the final memories of Deborah. In a small town like Ada, where many people often knew one another through work and social connections, the disappearance of a young person would naturally leave behind many questions. But at that time, No one could have imagined that Deborah's final night working at the Coachlight Club would become the beginning of a chain of events that would continue for nearly 2 decades. The people who encountered Deborah that day remembered her simply as a colleague, a friend, and a young woman living her own life. For investigators, however, the final hours before Deborah left the workplace would become one of the most important pieces of the puzzle in understanding what truly happened. In the 7th of December 1982, began, like many other working days for Deborah Sue Carter. That evening, she was at the Coachlight Club in Ada, Oklahoma, carrying out her usual shift. To those around her, it was simply another ordinary night at the place where Deborah regularly worked, where she met with co-workers, interacted with customers, and completed the responsibilities that had become part of her daily life. As the night continued and the club prepared to close, Deborah left her workplace. She then returned to her apartment in Ada. It was a familiar journey she had made many times before, a routine trip home after an ordinary day at work. The following hours remain largely undocumented. No one knew exactly what happened inside Deborah's apartment during that period. However, a phone call in the early hours of the morning would later become one of the most important moments in the entire investigation. Between approximately 2:30 and 3 a.m. on December 8, Deborah called her close friend Gina Vieta. During the conversation, Deborah's voice revealed a sense of unease. She told Gina that it appeared someone was inside her apartment and that something did not feel right. On the other end of the line, Gina noticed unusual sounds during the call. She could sense Deborah's concern and believed that something serious might be happening. At that moment, Deborah said she would check the situation and find out what was going on. The call ended, but not long afterwards, Deborah contacted Gina again. During the second conversation, she said that things seemed to be better and that she no longer needed her friend to come over. That was the last time Gina Vieta spoke directly with Deborah Carter. After that conversation, there was no further confirmed information about Deborah's activities during the remainder of that night. What happened after that point would only begin to come to light through the investigation that started the following morning. For investigators who later examined the case, that brief phone call became one of the most important details in reconstructing Deborah's final hours. It showed that the young woman was still able to reach out to the outside world only hours before the crime was discovered, while also leaving behind many unanswered questions about what occurred inside her apartment afterwards. After her final phone conversation with Gina Vieta in the early hours of the 8th of December 1982, Deborah Sue Carter returned to her apartment in Ada. The period that followed remains the most mysterious part of the case, as investigators could only reconstruct what happened inside the apartment through the evidence that remained at the scene. When police began examining the apartment, they quickly realized this was not an ordinary situation. The signs inside indicated that something serious had taken place, turning the home where Deborah had lived her daily life into the center of a criminal investigation that would continue for many years. One of the details that drew investigators' attention was the way certain elements had been left inside the room. The writing found at the scene, including the word "die" written in nail polish on the victim's body and the name Duke Graham written in ketchup on her back, quickly became controversial clues during the early stages of the investigation. In addition, a message left inside the apartment caused police to initially consider the possibility that multiple people could have been involved. These signs created the impression that the case may have involved a group of individuals or a more complicated motive. However, as the investigation continued over the following years, authorities began questioning the reliability and meaning of those details. Some experts and investigators later suggested that parts of the crime scene may have been deliberately staged to create false leads, directing police attention towards incorrect theories. In 1982, crime scene analysis still relied heavily on the interpretation of physical evidence, witness statements, and conclusions drawn from the available information. As a result, the details discovered inside Deborah's apartment had a significant influence on how investigators approached the case during its early stages. But behind those misleading signs remained a more important question that investigators needed to answer. Who was actually inside Deborah's apartment that night, and what evidence could lead them to the truth? On the morning of the 8th of December, 1982, the unusual circumstances surrounding Deborah Sue Carter's absence began to cause concern among the people who knew her. After the early morning phone call with Gina Vieta, no one received any further communication from her. As the hours passed, and Deborah neither appeared nor responded to attempts to contact her, the worry surrounding her situation became increasingly clear. Someone who knew Deborah decided to go to her apartment in Ada to check on her. At first, it may have seemed like nothing more than a visit motivated by concern for a friend. But after entering the apartment, they quickly realized that something serious had happened. Deborah was found deceased inside the apartment. Police in Ada were immediately notified and quickly arrived at the scene. A situation that had begun as concern over a young woman who had stopped responding had now become a serious criminal investigation. The area around the apartment was examined, and investigators began documenting the initial details in an effort to determine what had occurred after Deborah's final phone call. News of the incident quickly spread throughout the small community of Ada. For those who knew Deborah, the discovery was deeply shocking. Only hours earlier, she had been working at the Coachlight Club, moving through a familiar environment and being seen by those around her as she went through an ordinary night. But by that morning, her life had changed completely, and the apartment that had once been her private home became the starting point of an investigation that would continue for many years. Investigators were immediately faced with several critical questions. Who was the last person to be with Deborah? What happened during the hours between her early morning phone call and the moment she was discovered? And could the evidence left behind at the scene help reveal the truth? From that moment, the case of Deborah Sue Carter officially began, setting in motion an investigation that would later become one of the most well-known wrongful conviction cases in the history of the United States justice system. When Ada police arrived at Deborah Sue Carter's apartment on the morning of 8 December 1982, their first priority was to secure the scene and document every detail that could help reconstruct what had happened. The apartment was placed under control to limit access, while investigators began examining each area inside the residence. At that time, every detail at the scene could potentially become an important part of the investigation. Forensic personnel photographed the location, documented the position of objects, collected remaining traces of evidence, and assessed the condition of the apartment. Their goal was to find clues that could help determine the sequence of events and identify anyone who may have been involved. During the initial examination, authorities determined that Deborah had died inside the bedroom of the apartment. The scene indicated that they were dealing with a serious criminal investigation, requiring a much broader effort to understand what had occurred in the hours after her final phone call. Investigators collected various forms of physical evidence from the apartment. This included biological samples left behind at the scene, strands of hair discovered during the examination, material traces connected to the room, and personal items that could provide information about anyone who may have been present. However, in 1982, criminal investigations did not yet have access to DNA analysis technology as it exists today. The samples collected at the time could not immediately produce a precise identification profile to determine who was responsible. Investigators had to rely on traditional methods, including evidence analysis, information comparisons, witness statements, and developing theories based on the available details. This made the search for answers far more difficult. The evidence preserved from the scene still had value, but the technology of that era was not advanced enough to reveal all the information contained within those samples. As a result, the case entered a complex investigative phase, with police searching for answers through incomplete clues and pieces of information that had not yet formed a clear picture of what truly happened. After completing the initial examination of Deborah Sue Carter's apartment, Ada police entered an investigative phase under growing pressure. A young woman from their small community had lost her life, and finding the person responsible became the highest priority for law enforcement. In the days following the incident, investigators focused on gathering information from those who had interacted with Deborah before the events took place. They interviewed friends, co-workers, and anyone who might provide insight into her daily life. The goal was to understand Deborah's personal connections, reconstruct her movements on the final night, and determine who may have been present during the crucial hours before her death. One location that drew the attention of investigators was the Coachlight Club, where Deborah had worked on the evening of 7 December 1982. Police sought information from people who had been there that night, attempting to piece together Deborah's final activities before she returned to her apartment. As investigators reviewed the people who had contact with Deborah, the name Glenn Gore began to appear. Gore was an acquaintance of Deborah and had been present at the Coachlight Club on the night of the crime. According to information later documented during the investigation, he was the last person known to have seen Deborah alive. This was a significant detail, because in many criminal investigations, identifying the last known person to interact with a victim is often a critical line of inquiry that requires careful examination. However, during the early stages of the Deborah Carter investigation, law enforcement did not focus sufficient attention on Glenn Gore. Instead, the investigation gradually shifted toward other directions based on the evidence found at the scene and the information available at the time. Several theories emerged, but there was not enough clear evidence to identify the person responsible. As a result, the case continued with many unanswered questions. Investigators were faced with a large amount of information that they were unable to connect into a complete explanation, while Deborah's family and the Ada community continued waiting for answers about what had happened to Deborah Sue Carter. Sometime after the investigation began, the Deborah Sue Carter case took a new direction when authorities shifted their attention toward two men living in Ada, Ronald Keith Williamson and Dennis Fritz. Ronald Keith Williamson was born in 1953 and had once been a promising baseball player during his younger years. He was considered a talented athlete, with the potential to pursue a professional career. However, when his baseball ambitions did not develop as expected, Williamson's life began to change. He eventually returned to Ada and was living in the community at the time of the crime. The second man was Dennis Fritz, a high school science teacher and also a friend of Williamson. Compared with Williamson, Fritz had a more stable life, working in education and having no known history of serious criminal activity before the investigation. During the investigation, police began to suspect that the two men might have been connected to Deborah Carter's death. Information gathered from interviews and other sources led authorities to believe that Williamson and Fritz could be involved in the case. They soon became the central focus of the investigation. However, one of the most controversial aspects of the case was that the evidence used against them did not include strong, direct physical proof linking them to the crime scene. No DNA evidence existed at the time to confirm their presence inside Deborah's apartment. The significant evidence collected from the scene also failed to establish a clear connection between the two men and the crime. Despite this, investigators continued building their case based on the information available at the time. Statements, investigative conclusions, and forensic interpretations based on the standards of the 1980s gradually became the foundation that directed the investigation toward Williamson and Fritz. The decision to consider these two men as suspects marked a major turning point in the case. However, years later, this same investigative process and the original conclusions would become the focus of intense debate over failures within the justice system and how a case could move in the wrong direction when crucial evidence was not fully examined. When Ronald Keith Williamson and Dennis Fritz became the primary suspects in the Deborah Sue Carter case, prosecutors began building their case around evidence they believed would be strong enough to convince a jury. However, many of the elements used during this process would later become the subject of intense debate when the case was reviewed years afterward. One of the key foundations of the prosecution's case was testimony from individuals considered relevant witnesses. This information was used to strengthen the theory that Williamson and Fritz were connected to Deborah's death. In addition, investigators relied on microscopic hair analysis, a forensic technique that was widely used in many criminal cases during that period. The hair analysis results were presented at the time as evidence that could potentially connect the suspects to the crime scene. However, years later, when modern forensic methods were applied, the reliability of this type of evidence was significantly reconsidered. Experts concluded that microscopic hair comparison was not as scientifically precise as it had once been believed to be and could not identify a specific individual with the level of certainty previously suggested. The case file also relied on testimony from several inmates who claimed to have information related to the crime. However, the reliability of some of these statements was later questioned after concerns emerged that the information may have been influenced by personal benefits or other motives. Another serious issue discovered during the later review of the case was that some evidence favorable to the defendants was not fully considered during the original legal proceedings. This raised further questions about the accuracy of the investigation and the process used to build the prosecution's case. Based on the evidence presented at trial, Ronald Keith Williamson was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Dennis Fritz was convicted of involvement in the crime and received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Deborah Carter's family, the verdict at the time represented an ending after years of waiting for answers. But for the justice system, the case was far from truly closed. Questions about the quality of the investigation, the reliability of the evidence, and the possibility of a serious miscarriage of justice would continue to emerge in the years that followed. Those questions would eventually lead to a major turning point as modern forensic technology began re-examining the evidence that had once been used to convict two men. Years after the verdict was handed down, the Deborah Sue Carter case entered a new phase as forensic technology advanced and allowed investigators to re-examine evidence that had been preserved since 1982. Biological samples collected from the crime scene, which had been unable to provide clear answers at the time of the investigation, now became the key to reviewing the entire case. In 1999, experts conducted DNA testing on biological evidence that had remained preserved. This was a crucial examination designed to determine whether the individuals who had been convicted were actually connected to the crime scene. The DNA results created a complete turning point in the case. The DNA profile obtained from the evidence did not match Ronald Keith Williamson. At the same time, the results also showed no match with Dennis Fritz. This discovery raised serious questions about the accuracy of the original convictions. as both men had previously faced severe punishment based on other forms of evidence. After further comparison, the DNA sample was identified as matching Glenn Gore, the man who had been present at the Coachlight Club on the night Deborah Carter died and who was the last person known to have seen her alive. This information completely changed the way the case was viewed. Evidence that had once been considered sufficient to convict Williamson and Fritz was now placed under renewed scrutiny. DNA technology revealed a result that contradicted the conclusions reached at the original trial, while also raising the possibility that the initial investigation had followed the wrong path. After the new forensic findings were revealed, legal procedures began to review the convictions of Ronald Williamson and Dennis Fritz. On 15 April 1999, both men were released from prison after years of living under convictions for a crime they did not commit. For Williamson, who had once faced the possibility of execution, the reversal carried extraordinary significance. He had spent years in prison under the most severe sentence available before new scientific evidence demonstrated that the original conclusion was wrong. For Dennis Fritz, his exoneration also marked the end of a long period in which he had lost his freedom and reputation because of a crime he was not responsible for. The Deborah Sue Carter case later became one of the most prominent examples of how DNA evidence could be used to review previous convictions. It showed that evidence once considered certain could still require re-examination when science advances and more accurate investigative tools become available. At the same time, the outcome raised another important question. If the DNA evidence had never been tested again, would the truth about who was actually responsible for Deborah's death ever have been discovered? After DNA results identified Glenn Gore as being connected to evidence collected from the Deborah Sue Carter crime scene, the investigation officially entered a new phase. Information that had previously been overlooked during the original investigation was reviewed again, while authorities began a comprehensive reassessment of the entire case file. The presence of Gore's DNA in the forensic evidence became a crucial factor that allowed prosecutors to rebuild their case. Unlike the investigation in 1982, this time investigators had a powerful scientific tool that could establish a connection between a suspect and the crime scene. After reviewing the new evidence, Glenn Gore was officially charged in 2001 in his connection with Deborah Sue Carter's death. The case file was no longer based primarily on disputed testimony or older forensic methods, but instead focused heavily on DNA results and information gathered during the renewed investigation. On 24 June 2003, Glenn Gore was brought to trial and convicted of murdering Deborah Sue Carter. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, meaning he would spend the remainder of his life in prison without the opportunity for release through parole. The trial marked an important turning point in a search for the truth that had lasted more than 2 decades. However, for Deborah Carter's family, the conviction came after an extraordinarily long period since they had lost their loved one. The case was legally resolved regarding Glenn Gore, but it continued to leave serious questions about the years that came before. 2 men who had been wrongfully convicted had already endured consequences that could never be fully undone, while the person responsible for Deborah's death had remained unidentified for many years. The story of Deborah Sue Carter therefore became more than a case solved through DNA technology. It also became a reminder of the importance of carefully and accurately evaluating evidence within the justice system. For Deborah Sue Carter's family, this case was not only a decades-long investigation, but also a journey of living with a loss that could never be undone. A 21-year-old woman who once had a job, people who cared about her, and a future ahead of her was taken away from their lives on a December night in 1982. But beyond the pain of losing a loved one, the Deborah Carter case left behind another tragedy, a failure of justice. For many years, the truth remained hidden behind a series of wrongful conclusions. 2 men, Ronald Keith Williamson and Dennis Fritz, endured severe punishments for a crime they did not commit, while the person truly responsible for Deborah's death remained unidentified for years. The case became a warning about the limitations of criminal investigations when evidence is misinterpreted, when early theories are not properly challenged, and when a single mistake can change the lives of many people. However, Deborah Carter's story also demonstrated the power of modern forensic science. DNA technology could not restore the years lost by those who were wrongfully convicted, nor could it erase the pain experienced by Deborah's family. But it could bring the truth back into the light, help correct mistakes from the past, and return justice to those who had been forgotten. In the end, the case of Deborah Sue Carter was not only the story of a criminal investigation. It was the story of a family who lost someone they loved, of people who fought for years to prove their innocence, and of a truth that took nearly 2 decades to finally emerge. If you are interested in real criminal cases, long unsolved investigations, and the search for truth behind major cases, subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this. Every case leaves behind a lesson, and every victim deserves to be remembered.